Exploring abandoned places had become a habit of mine. There was something exhilarating about stepping into houses and buildings frozen in time, places no one had touched in years, sometimes decades. They were quiet spaces where the past lingered, untouched by the present. I stumbled across this house deep in the woods one afternoon, hidden behind overgrown trees and wild vines. It looked perfect, half collapsed, windows shattered, roof sagging with age. The forest had taken it back, like it was slowly being devoured by the land. There was no front door. It had fallen off long ago, leaving the entrance wide open. I didn't think twice before stepping inside. The wooden floor creaked beneath my boots, and the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and mildew. I walked through each room, scanning the remnants of a life left behind: dust-covered furniture, faded wallpaper, and sagging bookshelves. It was exactly the kind of place I loved to explore. But just as I was about to leave, something in the corner of the living room caught my attention. A torn, stained rug, bunched up strangely in one corner. I knelt down, grabbed the edge of the rug, and pulled it aside. Beneath it, a heavy wooden trapdoor was hidden, its surface worn and covered in grime. The sight of the trapdoor sent a ripple of excitement through me. This was what I lived for: the hidden corners, the places no one had touched in years. Without hesitation, I gripped the old iron handle and pulled. The hinges groaned in protest, the metal grinding against rust as the trapdoor swung open. A narrow wooden ladder disappeared into darkness. I hesitated, the flashlight beam from my hand trembling slightly. The air wafting up from below was stale and heavy, carrying the faint scent of mold. I shone the flashlight down, sweeping the beam across the space beneath. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than a forgotten basement. A jumble of old furniture, piles of clothes, and discarded shoes scattered across the floor. But something about the scene felt strange. The items didn't look old enough to have been abandoned for years. They were worn, yes, but not ancient, as if someone had used them not too long ago. And then my flashlight landed on something that made my breath hitch. A man was lying on the floor, curled up as if asleep. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. At first I thought he might be dead. His skin looked pale, almost sickly, and his clothes, though rumpled, weren't torn or filthy. For a long moment, I stood at the top of the ladder, unsure of what to do. Should I call out to him? Leave before he woke up? Then I saw it, his chest rising and falling with slow, shallow breaths. He was alive. I leaned forward slightly, shining the flashlight directly on him. His fingers twitched, and his breathing grew louder, more rhythmic. Panic began to creep in. I had no idea who this man was or why he was lying in an abandoned basement, but I knew I didn't want to be here when he woke up. I took a step back, the ladder groaning beneath me. The sound seemed to stir him. His fingers twitched again, more sharply this time, and I saw his eyelids flutter. He was waking up. The flashlight beam trembled as I aimed it toward the ladder. My pulse thundered in my ears, and instinct took over. I spun around and scrambled up the wooden rungs, my boots thudding loudly against the ladder as I climbed. Behind me, I heard it, the soft creak of movement. He was stirring, shifting on the floor. The thought of his eyes opening, of him seeing me, filled me with cold fear. I reached the top and heaved the trapdoor shut, the hinges screaming in protest. As it slammed into place, I heard something else. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the basement floor. The moment the trapdoor slammed shut, I bolted toward the front door. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, now. The wooden floor groaned under my weight as I sprinted across the living room, adrenaline surging through my veins. I couldn't hear much over the thundering in my ears, but faintly, just beneath the sound of my footsteps, I heard movement from below. Slow, deliberate footsteps. He was walking. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. My breath came fast and shallow, and all I could think was that I had to make it out before he reached me. Just as I reached the threshold of the front door, the sound from below shifted. It was subtle at first, a creak, a shuffle, and then a scream. It wasn't a scream of pain, nor was it the cry of someone in fear. No, this was something else entirely. It was high-pitched, sharp, and unnatural. The sound echoed through the walls of the house, bouncing off the empty rooms, filling every corner with its eerie presence. The kind of sound that doesn't belong in a place abandoned by life. A chill ran down my spine, and I knew I couldn't stay a second longer. I burst through the front door and ran as if my life depended on it. The woods felt darker than before, the trees closing in around me. Every step was filled with desperation, my breath ragged and sharp in my throat. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. My legs burned as I pushed forward, crashing through the underbrush, leaves and brambles snagging on my clothes. Finally, I stumbled to a stop, collapsing against a tree, gasping for breath. The forest was silent. The only sound was the frantic rise and fall of my breath as I leaned against the tree, trying to steady myself. I turned slowly, looking back through the dense woods. The house was out of sight, hidden by the trees and the darkness. I don't know who or what he was. There was something about the forgotten corners of the world, places where nature had crept back in, reclaiming what had been left behind. On this particular day, we decided to check out the old park at the edge of town. It had been closed for years, lost to time, with rumors that the forest had swallowed most of it whole. We followed what remained of the trail, pushing past brambles and weeds. Trees towered overhead, their branches twisting together like claws, blocking out the sun. There was an eerie beauty to it, the way the park seemed to belong to the forest now. The deeper we went, the quieter it became, as if the place itself had forgotten how to make noise. Then, as the path turned sharply toward the forest's edge, we stumbled upon it. A half-collapsed hut, hidden beneath layers of moss and rot. It looked like something from an old summer camp, long abandoned. The wooden frame sagged, and tarps clung limply to what remained of the roof. It seemed like no one had been here in decades. We stepped closer, curious about what might be inside. The door was barely hanging on its hinges, creaking softly as we pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled damp, like wet wood and decay. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, and old tarps, brittle with age, draped over splintered beams. It was the kind of scene we were used to, ruins of a life left behind, forgotten by everyone but nature. There wasn't much to see. I poked at some of the debris with my foot, but everything crumbled at the slightest touch. The light filtering through the cracked windows cast long shadows across the floor, making the place feel even more lifeless. We were just about to leave when something caught my eye, a faint flicker of light from inside the hut. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but enough to make me stop. My friend noticed it too, and we exchanged a curious glance. "Did you see that?" I whispered. The flickering grew steadier, and then, just barely, we heard it, low voices murmuring from inside the hut, as if someone had slipped inside while we weren't looking. At first, we thought it might be other explorers, or maybe some locals hanging out. We crouched by the broken window, straining to hear. The voices were quiet but deliberate, their words measured and tense. As we listened, bits of the conversation became clear. Talk of stolen goods, unfamiliar names, and something about a job they needed to finish. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. These weren't harmless wanderers. These were criminals. I glanced at my friend, and I could tell they were thinking the same thing. We had stumbled into something dangerous, something we were never meant to hear. The voices grew louder, angrier. One of the men mentioned that they were running out of time. My heart pounded as I realized we had to leave, right now, before they discovered us. We began to back away from the hut, trying to make as little noise as possible, but the forest around us was unnervingly quiet, amplifying every movement. I took one step back, then another. And then, crack. A twig snapped beneath my foot, the sound sharp and loud in the still night. It was the kind of noise that seemed impossible to miss. The conversation inside the hut stopped immediately. I heard chairs scrape against the floor, and my blood ran cold as footsteps moved toward the door. My friend and I locked eyes, panic flooding through us. Without a word, we turned and bolted, our footsteps pounding against the overgrown path, the forest suddenly feeling tighter around us. We didn't stop to think. We ran, crashing through the overgrowth, our breaths ragged and panicked. Behind us, angry shouts erupted from the hut. They had heard us, and they were coming. I could hear the crunch of boots on dirt, heavy and fast, growing louder with every step. My chest burned, my legs screamed in protest, but fear drove me forward. Branches scratched my arms and face, but I didn't care. I could feel the danger closing in behind us. the sound of footsteps relentless and unforgiving. There was no path to follow anymore, just the forest and the thick undergrowth pulling at our feet. My friend was just ahead of me, glancing back once, their wide eyes reflecting the same fear that pulsed through me. I knew we couldn't outrun them forever. We needed to find somewhere to hide. We veered off the trail, plunging deeper into the woods, hoping to lose them in the dense trees. That's when we spotted it, a cluster of crumbling concrete pillars, remnants of an old playground half buried beneath years of dirt and moss. Without thinking, we crouched behind the largest pillar, pressing ourselves against the cold stone, trying to disappear into the shadows. My heart thundered in my chest, and I clamped a hand over my mouth, desperate to quiet my breathing. The footsteps slowed as they neared. I could hear them, low voices muttering curses, frustrated grunts as they searched the underbrush. They were close, so close I could hear the scrape of their boots against the dirt. One of them muttered something about finding us, his voice sharp with anger. My friend squeezed my arm, and we both held our breath. Time stretched unbearably, every second feeling like an eternity. I pressed my back harder against the pillar, willing myself to be invisible. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. It was impossible to tell. All I knew was the sound of footsteps and angry voices, moving in and out of earshot, growing louder and softer as the search continued. Then finally, the sound began to fade. The men were moving further away, deeper into the forest. I didn't move, not yet. I kept perfectly still, listening as the footsteps drifted into the distance until they were no more than whispers among the trees. Even when everything was silent, we stayed where we were, too afraid to move. Every thump reminding me how close we had come to being found. When I was sure they were gone, I nudged my friend, and we crept out from behind the pillar. The forest around us was silent again, as if nothing had happened. We didn't wait to see if the men would return. As soon as we were sure the coast was clear, we ran, faster than we ever had before. We pushed through the undergrowth, ignoring the burning in our lungs and the sting of branches against our skin. The forest seemed endless, the darkness thickening around us, but we kept running until we saw the faint outline of the town in the distance. Relief hit me like a wave, but I didn't slow down until we reached the edge of town, breathless and trembling. We stopped, gasping for air, the adrenaline still coursing through our veins. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, as if it would burst out of my chest at any moment. My friend looked at me, and we both knew. We couldn't tell anyone what had happened. There was no proof, just a story no one would believe. And even if someone did, what could we say? That we stumbled upon criminals in the woods? That we had overheard something dangerous? No one would believe us. We made a silent pact that night, not to tell anyone, not to speak of the chase, the fear, or the men who had hunted us through the forest. I've always been drawn to abandoned places, their quiet, eerie beauty, the way time seems to stop within their walls. There's something irresistible about stepping into the past, into spaces where life once thrived but has long since faded. And for as long as I can remember, the old cathedral on the outskirts of town had been on my mind. Its towering spires rose above the treetops, weathered by centuries of wind and rain. People whispered stories about strange things happening there, unexplained noises, shadows seen through the stained glass windows at night, but no one dared go inside. The place had been left to rot, closed off from the world for decades. I had passed it many times, wondering what lay beyond the heavy stone walls. Each time I told myself I'd explore it, one day, but fear always held me back. It was too big, too ancient, too haunted by things I couldn't name. Then one day, curiosity finally overpowered my fear. I decided to go inside. The front entrance was cracked open, the wooden doors warped from years of rain. I slipped inside, my footsteps echoing through the vast empty hall. The air was cold and heavy, carrying the scent of dust and old stone. Sunlight streamed through the shattered stained glass windows, casting strange, colorful shapes on the cracked floor. The walls seemed to hum with silence, as if they remembered the prayers and hymns of a time long gone. I wandered deeper, my footsteps light on the stone. The cathedral felt impossibly large, with shadowy corners and towering ceilings that seemed to stretch forever. The air was thick with stillness. The deeper I went, the more I felt the weight of the place pressing in on me. It wasn't fear, exactly, more like an overwhelming sense that I didn't belong. And then I found them, a row of heavy wooden doors, each one sealed shut from the inside. The sight of the barricaded doors stopped me in my tracks. They were solid wood, ancient and weathered, with heavy beams braced across the insides. It made no sense. No one had entered the cathedral for decades, yet someone had gone through the trouble of sealing these doors from the inside. My hand hesitated on one of the door's iron handles, but curiosity pulled me forward. I gripped the handle and gave it a hard tug. The hinges groaned, the sound shattering the silence around me. The door swung open slowly, revealing a small room lit only by the dim glow of the stained glass filtering in from the hall. Dust floated in the air, disturbed by the sudden movement. I stepped inside, my heart pounding. The room was strange. Clothes lay scattered on the floor, wrinkled and covered in dust. Plates with old rotting food sat abandoned, as if someone had eaten here long ago and never returned. The walls were the worst part. Words, symbols, and frantic scribbles covered every surface. Some of the writing looked desperate, pleas for help, names scrawled over and over. Other messages made no sense at all, strange symbols and jagged lines scratched into the stone. It was as if someone had been hiding in this room, barricading themselves in, writing and rewriting their thoughts, waiting for something. But what, or from whom? I stood in the center of the room, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My mind raced with questions, but before I could think too deeply, I heard it. A sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. They were soft but deliberate, echoing through the cathedral. Someone else was here. I froze, straining to listen. The steps were slow, measured, as if the person knew exactly where they were going. My breath caught in my throat. No one else was supposed to be in this cathedral. Panic gripped me. I needed to leave, now. I crept to the doorway, peeking out into the hall. That's when I saw him, a man, his features hidden in shadow, walking toward the altar at the far end of the cathedral. His movements were deliberate, confident, as if he belonged here in a way I never could. Something about the way he moved sent a chill through me. This wasn't another explorer. This was someone, or something else. I stayed hidden in the doorway, my breath shallow, my heart pounding. The figure walked with purpose, each step echoing softly off the stone walls. He made his way toward the altar, as if it was a place he had been countless times before. Even though the light was dim, I could see just enough to know something was wrong. His posture was too steady, too deliberate. He moved with the ease of someone who knew the cathedral inside and out, someone comfortable in a place long forgotten by the world. The shadows clung to him, concealing his face. I couldn't see who he was, or what he was. A deep unease settled over me, a gnawing instinct that whispered I shouldn't be there. I told myself to leave, to slip away while his back was turned. But fear kept me rooted to the spot. Then, with sudden clarity, I knew. Whatever had driven someone to barricade themselves inside that room, it wasn't gone. And now I was standing in its presence. I couldn't stay any longer. I had to run. Without giving myself another moment to think, I bolted from the room. My footsteps echoed through the vast cathedral, the sound magnified by the empty space. I heard him behind me almost instantly. His footsteps were calm, measured, not running but following. His voice carried through the darkened hall, steady and commanding. "Stop! Wait! Don't run!" His words sent a spike of fear through me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran as fast as I could, weaving through the maze of darkened corridors and echoing chambers, my heart pounding in my chest. The cathedral seemed to twist around me, the walls pressing closer with every step. My legs burned and my lungs ached, but I couldn't stop. The cold night air hit me like a wave as I burst through the cathedral's entrance. I didn't slow down. I sprinted across the overgrown grounds, my footsteps crunching over dead leaves and broken stone. Behind me, the cathedral loomed like a dark silhouette against the fading sky. I could still hear his voice in my head, calm, deliberate, telling me to stop, to wait. But I knew better. Whatever that figure was, it wasn't something I wanted to meet. I ran until my legs felt like they would give out beneath me. Only when the cathedral was far behind did I finally stop, gasping for breath. My hands trembled as I leaned against a tree, glancing back toward the dark outline of the building in the distance. The figure was nowhere in sight, but the fear stayed with me, heavy and unshakable, like a shadow clinging to my skin. I stood there for a long time, staring back at the cathedral, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no answers came. I didn't know who that man was or what he had wanted from me. What disturbed me most wasn't that I had seen him. It was that he had spoken. He hadn't threatened me. He hadn't chased me. He had asked me to stop, to wait. What if he wasn't trying to harm me? What if he had been trying to warn me? The thought gnawed at me as I made my way back toward town.